Threads of History, a podcast that aims to go back in time to connect to an event or instance to its origin through several threads of continuity across time, space, culture, and historic moments. Welcome to the podcast. I am Mike Shellhammer. Today's episode is on arguably the most consequential change in technology in human history, the results of which started the long march to civilization and the resulting cities, bringing with them new problems which required unique solutions. For some of us, knowing everyone in town is a fact of life. You might have grown up in a place where you knew everyone in your high school by name. Maybe you only have 30 students in your graduating class. The culture shock of moving from that small town, knowing the 1,000 or so residents fairly well, to going to the big city where you are a faceless piece of the large population stretching into the millions, would be astronomical. Trying to know everyone is impossible. It's actually limited by human evolution. Seriously, it's called the Dunbar's number, and it says you'll likely only remember 150 people or 150 social connections, is what it says. So you might try to get to know others in your new big city. So you introduce yourself with your first name. That's simple enough. People do it all the time. But how does your reputation come to be known in this new big city? How do you make contacts, get connected to peers, or find a decent job? Well, you can differentiate yourself against those others named Mike and give your last name as well, like I do, of course. Even in a city with millions of people, odds are you'll be able to make a few poignant or connected people to remember you, and not some other Mike that's been around town. Maybe that other Mike is running around town doing a bunch of crap and he's literally giving you a bad name. But you're not him. You've got a unique last name to define who you are. This is the scenario we have play out in today's episode, the origin of last names, and sometimes referred to as surnames. To start this thread, we go back thousands of years before the dawn of man as we knew him. Archaeological data indicates that the domestication of various types of plants and animals happened not just in one place, but in multiple locations worldwide, starting about 12,000 years ago. This began the Neolithic, which means New Stone Age, revolution, also called the Agricultural Revolution. Many human cultures during the Neolithic period transitioned from a lifestyle of hunting and gathering in tribal bands of humans to a lifestyle of agriculture and settlement, making an increasingly large, relatively stable, and stationary population possible. During the next millennia, the Neolithic Revolution transformed the small tribes of hunter gatherers that dominated human prehistory into non nomadic societies based in villages and towns, creating more of a built up society. These societies would modify their natural environment by creating specialized food crop cultivation, with activities such as irrigation and deforestation, which allowed the production of surplus food. Other developments that would be found widely during this era are the domestication of animals, the creation of pottery and polished stone tools. Another hallmark of this period was the creation of rectangular houses. In many regions, agriculture brought about episodes of rapid population growth, a phenomenon known as the Neolithic demographic transition. You just had more and more people being created because more and more food was also being created. These developments, sometimes called the Neolithic package, provided the basis for centralized administrations and political structures. These hierarchical ideologies, like religion, we also have depersonalized systems of knowledge, like writing. Like you don't have to be face to face communicating with someone in order to communicate a message. Densely populated settlements, specialization and division of labor, intersettlement trade, the development of non portable art and architecture, stuff that stays in place, and greater property ownership. So that's all part of the Neolithic package. There is no documented and widely agreed upon sequence of emergence for these characteristics of social evolution. It's There's just no way of knowing which one came first in a lot of cases. Various Neolithic sites have some characteristics at different times and in different sequences, and so there's really no universal laws of social evolution. People just found a way to survive and to thrive. The Levant, modern day northern Iraq, Syria, and eastern Turkey, saw the earliest developments of the Neolithic Revolution at about 10,000 BC, followed by sites in the lower Fertile Crescent. Along with agriculture, we can see the domestication of animals around this time. The Middle East served as a source for many animals that could be domesticated, such as sheep, goats, and pigs. The presence of these animals gave the region a large advantage in cultural and economic development. You might be thinking, wow, this variety of animals in the Levant and Fertile Crescent, they were all domesticated around the same time? Is the Fertile Crescent even all that fertile anymore? It turns out, yes, actually. In many places, it still has lots of arable land. However, at 10,000 BC, had a much more rainy and fertile swath of land in the Levant and between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. And those areas were used to raise livestock at this time and still today. As the climate in the Middle East changed and became drier, many of the farmers were forced to leave, taking their domesticated animals with them. It was this massive emigration from the Middle East that later helped distribute these animals to northern Africa, into Europe, and to wider Asia. This emigration was mainly on an east west axis because the domestication of grain and other crops meant that they had to find areas with similar climates. Too much change in daylight or the common rainfall, and your crops would fail. For instance, wheat does not normally grow in tropical climates, just as tropical crops like bananas don't grow in colder climates. We have authors like Jared Diamond, whose book Guns, Germs, and Steel, which I read in college, uh, they brought forth the idea that this band of climatized agriculture running east west along the axis of the earth is the main reason why plant and animal domestication spread so quickly from the Fertile Crescent to the rest of Eurasia and North Africa, while it didn't go south through the equator to reach other Mediterranean style climates like those of South Africa, where temperate crops are successful today. To back up this theory, the African zebu was never domesticated past Central Africa, and the cows of the Fertile Crescent, which were separated by the dry Sahara Desert, were not introduced into each other's regions. Like the zebu would definitely thrive in the Middle Eastern climate, but they would have to be transported across the Sahara Desert. And 10,000 BC, they didn't have cargo ships, did they? No, they did not. The wider and easier availability of food caused a surplus of food that resulted in more inhabitants spending their precious time on becoming artisans, priests, and political leaders rather than working to gather or hunt for food. The traditional view is that agriculture supported a denser population in a sedentary, settled lifestyle. Jared Diamond, this time his book is The World Until Yesterday, identifies the availability of milk and cereal grains as permitting mothers to raise both a preschool age child and a baby concurrently. Doing this, a population can increase more rapidly. It was the original baby boom, is sort of the idea there. These larger communities, populated by many thousands, would allow individuals to accumulate goods and tools and begin to specialize in diverse forms of new labor. Larger societies meant that communities needed different means of decision making and governmental organization. If you've ever tried to organize a group of adults to do anything, you'd appreciate the larger scale difficulties people might face trying to create community spaces, shared resources, and provide for the community's safety. The development of a social elite would fill the need to control this community, partly because they were not otherwise engaged in agriculture, industry, or commerce. These elites would dominate their communities and monopolize decision making. Does that sound like real life today? I think so. The agricultural revolution brought about deep social divisions between those in power and those without power, and encouraged gender inequality. Through developments in theological depictions from before and after the Neolithic agricultural revolution, We can make a comparison of aquatic deities and note that Venus of Lepure from 24,000 years ago in southern Europe and the Greco Roman deities such as Circe or Charybdis 20,000 years later. The former figurine apparently venerated and respected, carved from ivory, but Circe and Charybdis would be dominated, basically a being that needs to be conquered. Roles within society became more restrictive and more rationalized through the conditioning effect of religion, meaning that religious beliefs changed to support the social hierarchy and going forward would then be justifying it, basically feeding back into the loop of justifying the world as it is and then making sure it never changed, but only because they had already changed the world beforehand. That's gender inequality. Andrew Sherratt has argued that following upon the Neolithic Revolution was the second phase of discovery that he refers to as the secondary products revolution. As you can imagine, when hunting and gathering animals and plants, humans killed the animals for their meat and might not have bothered with using them for anything else. There might not have been the tools available to do such things, or perhaps there was no time because the tribe was moving on to the next hunting ground almost constantly. After all, wild animals did not stay in one place, so how could humans be expected to do the same? So, when they were first domesticated, animals were purely a source of meat. The secondary products revolution occurred when it was recognized that animals also provided a number of other useful products. These included hides and skins, and this would be from wild animals living near the community or possibly attracted by the presence of humans and their domesticated animals. Manure for soil conditioning, and this would be from all the domesticated animals. There'd be wool to be gathered from sheep and goats. There'd be milk, which would be coming from goats as well. Cows and cattle is an obvious one to us in modern Western culture. But you also have milk from yaks, sheep's milk, horse milk, camel milk. You had transportation. We mentioned cattle, the onagers, which looked like a donkey, horses, camels, all good for transportation. Then you have the duties of guarding and herding, which could be done by dogs, though the domestication of dogs is something that happened way earlier than this period. Like that topic really interests me. So I will end up, that'll be part of a future Threads of History episode. Sherratt argued that this phase in agricultural development enabled humans to make use of the energy possibilities of their animals in new ways, and that helped humans with subsistence farming and crop production, and even expanding farming in otherwise heavy soils which were unsuited to it. It also made nomadic pastoralism, which is the raising of goats, especially in places like the Levant, semi arid areas today, along the margins of deserts. It made that all possible. That would lead then to the domestication of both species of camel in the Middle East. It would be the first example of widespread human terraforming, and that the activities of humans in these areas with these herds would contribute to greater desertification and less grasslands. So tough to be the humans doing that. It's happening today too. Less and less grassland, greater and greater expanses of things like the Sahara Desert due to human activity. And they were doing it 10,000 years ago. Living in relatively permanent settlement meant one could gather personal possessions. Neolithic farmers were able to stockpile food to survive lean times and trade unneeded surpluses with people in their society. Stockpiles of surplus food and other larger scale agricultural adjacent activities to benefit the larger size society would have been one of the first reasons for the forming of governments during the Neolithic Revolution. Some would have free time to enjoy because of the surplus of food, sometimes due to large scale agriculture. And so then you'd have artisans in turn be able to develop technology like metal weapons and tools that would be unavailable beforehand. This relative complexity required some form of social organization to work efficiently, so it's likely that the first societies that had such organization, whether from proto governmental bodies or gathering philosophy, a shared culture, a shared religion. We're not quite sure. One benefit, at least in terms of resource protection and procurement, was the fact that more people in a society meant the surplus people not needed to make the food to be involved in the agriculture could be trained to be soldiers. Yay, war. Isn't it great? During this time, property ownership became increasingly important for people, especially when you consider the fact that farmers' property would be tasked with keeping the entire town alive. So it made sense that they needed to keep these people protected, need to keep the land protected. And so possession and personal property and protection for a community very important in this time period. Only once early humans brought together most of these characteristics, which would be the food crop cultivation, governmental and hierarchical forms of authority, art and writing, large scale projects like irrigation and deforestation, the domestication of animals, the creation of tools and other technology, development of language, development of religion. Can we call an early human society an actual civilization? The earliest known civilization developed in Sumer in southern Mesopotamia about 6,500 years ago. Its realization would mark the beginning of what we call the Bronze Age. Around this time, we had another revolution coming into human habitation, this one being called the Urban Revolution. In anthropology and archaeology, the urban revolution is the process by which small, kin based, illiterate agricultural villages were transformed into large, socially complex urban societies. The term urban revolution was introduced in the 1930s by V. Gordon Childe, an Australian archaeologist called the most influential archaeologist of the 20th century. Child also coined the term Neolithic Revolution to describe the lifestyle we were just discussing a few moments ago. It's no surprise, Child being a Marxist, that he defined early man's collective struggles forward as revolutions. I suppose revolutions against nature or revolutions against human limitations. Child was the first to define, in social terms, the large volume of new archaeological. That's hard to say, the new archaeological data coming into academia in the early 20th century. Whereas previous archaeologists had concentrated on chronology and technology, Child applied concepts and theories from the social sciences to interpret archaeological finds. It's not really surprising that social conditions were not widely regarded at this time or before Child's time due to sociology being a relatively new science. Sociology had been coined by the Frenchman Auguste Comte only a century before Child's work. Child first discussed urban revolution in his 1936 book, Man Makes Himself, but only later in the 1950 article in the journal Town Planning Review, which must be a banger. I should read that. Was the concept brought to a larger audience? So more audience than his book, I suppose. In that paper, he presented a 10-point model for the changes that characterize the urban revolution. Number one, in point of size, the first cities must have been more extensive and more densely populated than any previous settlements. Number two, in composition and function, the urban population already differed from that of any village. Full time specialist craftsmen, transportation workers, merchants, officials, and priests. Number three, each primary producer paid over the tiny surplus he could wring from the soil with his still very limited technological equipment as a tithe or a tax to a deity or to a divine king, divinely chosen king, who thus concentrated the surplus. Number four, truly monumental public buildings not only distinguish each known city from any village, but they also symbolize the concentration of the social surplus. Number five, naturally, priests, civil and military leaders, and officials absorbed a major share of the concentrated surplus and thus became or formed a ruling class. Number six is just simply writing. Number seven, the elaboration of exact and predictive sciences like arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. Number eight, conceptualized and sophisticated styles. Number nine, regular foreign trade over quite long distances. And number 10, a state organization based now on residence rather than on kinship. So it wasn't about the tribe because in the tribe you're all related. With a state organization It's now based on where you live. If you live inside the quote unquote the urban area, the city, then you're part of the city, you're part of the organization, you get taxed, you contribute things, you could be a part of this whole system here. Uh, that's number 10 there, based on child's work. Although sometimes interpreted as a model of the origins of cities and urbanism, Child's concept, in fact, describes the transition from agricultural villages to state level urban societies. This change, which occurred independently in several parts of the world, is recognized as one of the most significant changes in human sociocultural evolution. Although the origins of complex urban societies have progressed beyond Child's original formulation, there's a general agreement that he correctly identified one of the most far reaching social transformations prior to the Industrial Revolution, as well as the major processes that are involved. Though on its face, the urban revolution was the drive to form cities and urban communities, it was almost entirely a transformation of social institutions and practices. Kings with real power emerged for the first time, accompanied by institutions of government and social stratification. Economic activity of all sorts expanded greatly, which necessitated the founding of the first cities. Child used the phrase urban revolution to refer to this interconnected series of changes. He did not limit the term to just the development of cities. For him, cities were just one component of the overall process by which complex state level societies came into being. By the 1970s, cultural evolutionists started using the phrase the rise of the state for this process, and for the most part, that is how it remains conceptualized today. Early cities and states arose independently in six parts of the world, focused in areas of Mesoamerica, the Andes Mountains, the Fertile Crescent, the Nile River Valley, the Indus River Valley, and the Huanghe, or Yellow River Valley. The earliest state societies in these regions evolved out of simpler societies without substantial influence from pre existing states. There's just no evidence of significant states before these. This process is known as the primary state formation. Some primary states expanded through conquest, but in other cases, nearby areas developed state institutions of their own from cultural diffusion as a result of trade or political competition with the original states. So now we have the cities causing the gathering of populations and the further development of technology and other advances of civilization. What did these cities look like? And what were some of these earliest cities in the world? The first cities appeared thousands of years ago in areas where the land was fertile, mostly along major rivers, such as the cities founded in Mesopotamia around 7500 BC, which included Eridu, Uruk, and Ur. Ur. These cities were among the many communities between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, and I'm sure you could find them in the Bible. We're talking very, very old. Cities also formed elsewhere independently, as if it was an inevitable sign of progress, human progress. Cities were formed like Memphis along the Nile River in Egypt. You had Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus River Valley. You had Luoyang and the Huanghe River Valley in China. Agricultural production in these fertile areas meant that people could give up the nomadic lifestyle as hunters and gatherers and take advantage of those food surpluses we've been talking about. Settling along waterways not only provided easy access to fresh water and irrigation methods for agriculture, but also provided the much needed transportation system that would facilitate trade. For the next several millennia, cities continued to grow in number, size, and in technology. Some of the world's largest cities have grown steadily for hundreds of years, while others appear to blossom overnight. Some of the cities that were once among the most populous in the world, like the largest cities in Mesopotamia, no longer exist, and others have experienced a decline in population. It feels like a cruel joke, that tens of thousands of Mayans lived for hundreds of years in a place like Tikal, but now it's been taken over by the jungle of the Yucatan. Many cities have had periods of growth and stagnation and fall and then rebirth. Actually, way too many to count. For instance, in the first century BC, Rome, Italy topped 1 million people, making it the largest city in Europe, but its population declined to just 20,000 people during the Middle Ages, far from the wonders of the height of the Roman Empire. Though there are exceptions, most cities do not permanently fall. Most of the world's cities continue to grow relatively steadily from the early modern period onward to today. And whether by need or economics, demographics, or resources, some are experiencing growth at unprecedented rates. In fact, the population of Rome was about 3 million at last most recent count. Throughout history, people have been drawn to cities as centers of trade, culture, education, and economic opportunity, but the resulting urban population growth has not always been steady. Indeed, steady and widespread heavy urbanization is a relatively recent phenomenon. Even in the last 200 years, the vast majority of people still lived in rural areas and smaller villages and communities. More than 90% of the global population is estimated to have lived in rural areas in 1800 AD. So we're talking about 200 years ago. The United States Census Bureau indicates that more than 94% of the U.S. population lived in rural areas in 1800, but as a sign of prosperity and opportunity found in cities, by 1900, only 40%, or I'm sorry, 40% of the population lived in cities. That means 60% lived in rural areas. And then by 2000, it's at 80% of the US population living in urban areas. So we see the urbanization of America, and we've seen that around the world as well. One of the main reasons for the growth of cities was yet another revolution, this one being called the Industrial Revolution. And I'll probably have a thread of history about this at some point in the future. It's a huge piece of human history. It began in England towards the middle of the 18th century, using steam and water power, and then spread to the United States and other parts of Europe over the next century. The Industrial Revolution contributed to the rise of factories, creating a demand for workers and requiring the gathering of workers in urban areas to populate the factory floor. This was a huge change from things like the manor system of the Middle Ages or the domestic system that was prevalent before industry was developed. Due to the Industrial Revolution, millions of people in the United States and Europe moved from the farms into the cities. As other parts of the world industrialized, they too became more urban. Thanks in part to the Industrial Revolution, London, England, grew from the population of 1 million in 1800 to over 6 million just 10 years later. Within a few other decades, the so called Second Industrial Revolution boosted urbanization in the US, spurring New York City to become the largest city in the world by 1950, with a population of 12.5 million. New York City has since been supplanted, but the number of cities with more than a million people living in them has risen astronomically over the last 70 years. Urban population growth has been fueled by new technologies, most notably technologies that enabled cities to build upward. Innovations in steel enabled the development of skyscrapers, which allowed for greater population densities. And of course, the invention of the elevator made it possible for skyscrapers to take people upwards to their suites and offices in the sky. Before elevators, the penthouse top of a high rise building was actually for the poorer tenants, not the richest, because they had to take the stairs the entire way up. Experts say that over half the world's population today lives in urban areas, and that around two-thirds of people will be living in cities by 2050, so about 25 years from now. Much of this growth is due to natural increase, meaning that births and families already living in the cities, as well as the continued migration of people from rural to urban areas in search of new opportunities. In some countries, these migrations are not just necessary, but encouraged by government development. Urbanization in recent years has fueled the growth of ever larger cities and to a new type of city, the megacity, which is defined as having a population of 10 million or more. The metropolitan areas of New York City and Tokyo, Japan became the world's first megacities in the 1950s. I'll actually be in Tokyo this time next week. There are 33 megacities across the globe in 2021, depending on the definition of the city's borders. While the largest cities of the Industrial Revolution existed in North America and Europe, nowadays it's Asia and Africa that are experiencing the greatest urban growth due to industrialization. As of 2019, Tokyo has more than 37 million residents, and is the world's largest urban area. Delhi, India has almost 30 million. Shanghai, China, Mexico City, Sao Paulo, Brazil, they all have metro area populations of well over 20 million. That's a significant number of people in your community, to say the least. That's a significant number of people. If you live in the middle of Mexico City in 2023, how do you differentiate yourself? With modern technology today, it's relatively easy for someone to confirm you are who you say you are. You have identification cards, licenses, passports. They all track people and confirm for other organizations and businesses and governments to confirm you are who you say you are. But without modern technology, there's no way to identify anyone outside a register of names, maybe a description. You go back before photos, you have people making portraits, but it's not all that common for everybody to have a portrait made of themselves. Maybe someone there will know your face. Maybe they'll know your family. Maybe they'll know your reputation just by hearing about you. But then again, how would they know your family if you had only one name to identify you? Are you Mike, that's the son of Mitchell, or the son of Pete? How would anyone know you are who you say you are without enough connections to other people, providing people with context to relate you to them? That's where we finally come into the origin of last names. With the gathering of people in large cities and the increase in travel between cities, you now have a need for distinguishing one person from another in a huge sea of people. Deaths and war necessitated this distinction. For instance, the dog tag to identify soldiers uh, was not invented until the American Civil War, and that was to help identify the dead that would be maimed by the machines of war. Communication technology also made the distinction of people much more necessary. Are you the person that's meant to receive this particular telegram? Even law enforcement, with many forces being formed in the late 19th century, was affected by this issue. How could they know they arrested the right person for a crime if they cannot adequately identify the suspects? While the use of given names to identify individuals is attested in the oldest historical records, basically when there's written accounts, we have people identified with a first name and maybe a title or their job, but that's as far as it goes in antiquity. Archaeologists would say that the advent of surnames is a relatively recent phenomenon. Many cultures have used and continue to use additional descriptive terms in identifying individuals beyond their given name, their first name. These terms may include personal attributes like location of origin, occupation, parentage, patronage, adoption, or their clan, their tribe affiliation. These descriptors often developed into fixed clan, tribal identifications that would identify their kin. It would identify your family. They would then become last names, or sometimes, like we said, last name or surname, an individual's full name as we know them today. In China, records and evidence shows that family names started around 2000 BC. China was likely the first civilization to create last names. The administration of Emperor Fuxi standardized the naming system in order to facilitate census taking and the use of census information. Originally, Chinese surnames were derived matrilineally, meaning that they would be passed down through the mother's side of the family and the children would take the name of the mother. However, there's evidence that by the time of the Shang dynasty, which was about 400 years later, 1600 BC to about 1000 BC, they had become patrilineal, meaning that the name came from the father's side of the family. Chinese women do not change their names upon marriage. They can be referred to either by their full birth name or as their husband's surname plus the word for wife. In the past, women's given names were often not publicly known, and women were referred to in official documents by their family name plus the character she. And then when they were married, they would gain their husband's surname, add that to the birth surname and the character she. In the Middle East, surnames have been and are still of great importance. An early form of tribal nisbas, which a nisba is a sort of pseudo surname sort of descriptor, is attested among the Amorite and Aramean tribes in the early Bronze and Iron Ages. And this is evidence as early as 1800 BC. In ancient Iran, surnames were used, but it's likely that most of them belonged to the aristocracy, the nobility, and to military leaders. And this is going to be a theme in Europe as well. Among the most famous historical houses were the Achaemenids, the Arsacids, and the Sasanians. These nobilities would have been recognized by their seals, their coat of arms, and their banners, in which Shah Naman, or the Book of Kings, provided a good source of information about them. In the early Islamic period, which would be from 640 AD to 900 AD, the use of patronymics is well known, and these are names coming from the father or the paternal line. Famously, however, the Islamic scholar Raziz is referred to as Al Razi, literally meaning the one from Ray, did his origins from the city of Ray in Iran. In the Levant, it was common for people to derive their surname from a distant ancestor, and historically, the surname would be often preceded with ibn, which is Arabic for son of. Arab family surnames often denote either one's tribe or profession, a famous ancestor, or the place of origin, but these weren't universal. For example, Hunayan ibn Ashak, which lived in 850 AD, was known by his Nizba, which was al Abadi, a federation of Arab Christian tribes that lived in Mesopotamia prior to the advent of Islam. Hamdan ibn al Shahath, the founder of the Karmatian Islamism, was surnamed Karmat, which is the Aramaic word, which probably meant red eyed or short legged, which seems like really two different, very different things. So I'm curious how it could mean red eyed or short legged. Either he was a really short guy or he had like a really like fiery temper. Not really sure on that one. In ancient Greece, as far back as the Archaic period, which was about 800 BC, clan names and patronymics, similar to those found in the Middle East, like son of, were also common, as in Aristides, son of Lysimachus. They just put on the son of whoever. For example, Alexander the Great was known as Heraclides. Heraclides? As a supposed descendant of Heracles, or the Romanized Hercules. So the same guy. And then he would be referred to by the dynastic name of Keranos or Keranus, which is referred to the founder of the dynasty to which he belonged. So these patronymics were already attested for many characters in the works of Homer, which date to the archaic period of Greek history. So we've got evidence of this within Homer, in the Iliad, where you have the son of, but you also have these dynastic names or famous descendants names, or I'm sorry, famous ancestor names coming to be important for their descendants, like with Alexander. He wasn't called Alexander the Great at the time of his, time of his life. They might have thought he was great, but they definitely didn't call him great at the time. In none of these cases, though, were these names considered essential parts of the person's name. It was just another descriptor. They weren't explicitly inherited either, as in the manner that's common with many cultures or most cultures today. So, in other words, they really weren't the true surnames that we talk about today. So, it's the origin, but we're still kind of developing the ideas of what surnames are supposed to be or what they would become in modern day today. In the Roman Republic and the later Roman Empire, the use of different naming conventions went through multiple changes over their history. I'm going to use a lot of Latin here, so hold up. The nomen, the name of the gens inherited patrilineally, are thought to have been in use already in 650 BC. So this is predating the formation of the Roman state. The nomen was to identify group kinship, while the prenomen was used to distinguish individuals. So that would be like a first name. The female prenomen were less common as women had reduced public influence and were commonly known by the feminine form of the nomen alone. Some women were distinguished from relatives later on by the use of a major or minor. So and so the major, so and so the minor. The number of commonly used prenomen was severely restricted, with some falling out of use and very few new names gaining popularity. During the Republic, 99% of Romans shared one of 17 praenomen. So that's as if the only last names you could have in ancient Rome would be the starting roster for the Pittsburgh Penguins. In addition, eldest sons were frequently given the same praenomen as their father. The result was that there was reduced distinction between the members of the same family line. Like, which one are you talking about? Therefore, from the 5th to the 2nd centuries BC, the use of cognomen arose, beginning in noble patrician families. So it's once again hitting on this theme that nobility had the most use for naming conventions and would create these new naming conventions. There were originally personal names, frequently physical features. For example, the cognomen of Publius Ovidius Naso, Naso meaning nose. So I guess he had a big nose or a distinctive nose. In time, you had the cognomen, and they be given to children as inherited names. And so they cease to be the personal distinguisher. So now you got to have a new name to figure out who this person is. In the later centuries of the empire, there was this proliferation of similar agnomen for further distinction. So you had another name added to that name. And that's why you get the real name of Julius Caesar actually being Gaius Julius Caesar. And he actually shared that name with his father. Later, with the gradual influence of Greek and Christian culture throughout the Roman Empire, Christian religious names were sometimes put in front of the traditional cognomens, but eventually people reverted to single names only. By the time of the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, family names were uncommon across the Roman Empire, west and east. In Western Europe, where Germanic culture dominated the aristocracy, family names were almost non existent. They would not significantly reappear again in places like the Eastern Roman society until the 10th century, apparently influenced by the familial affiliations of the Armenian military aristocracy. So, once again, seeing the aristocracy and the nobility have the need for these family names or last names, surnames, as opposed to the peasantry. The practice of using family names spread through the Eastern Roman Empire and gradually into Western Europe, although it was not until the modern era that family names came to be explicitly inherited as they are today. Medieval Spain used a patronymic system, which we've mentioned before, based on family ties through a father. For example, Alvaro, the son of Rodrigo, would be named Alvaro Rodriguez. His son Juan would not be named Juan Rodriguez, but Juan Alvarez. Over time, many of these patronymic names became family names and are some of the most common names in the Spanish speaking world. I am going to ask you to bear with me on some of these pronunciations because I'm not familiar with speaking these languages regularly, so I might mispronounce a few things, but I'm trying. Other sources of surnames are personal appearance or habit. For instance, Delgado means thin and Moreno means dark. Geographic location or ethnicity. An example would be Aleman, which means German. Occupations. Molinero would be miller. Zapatero would be shoemaker. And Guerrero would mean warrior. Although occupational names are much more often found in the shortened form, referring to the trade itself, with examples being Molina, Guerrera, or Zapata, which I know that means shoe. Zapato, Zapata, Zapato. In England, the introduction of family names is generally attributed to the preparation of the Domesday Book in 1086, following the Norman conquest that began in 1066. So here we get around the 10th century, as it was mentioned in the Eastern Roman Empire. So now, about another century later, towards the west, and then eventually falling into England here. Evidence indicates that surnames were first adopted among the feudal nobility and gentry and slowly spread to other parts of society. Some of the early Norman nobility who arrived in England during the Norman conquest differentiated themselves by affixing de, meaning of, before the name of their own village or town of origin in France. This is what is known as a territorial surname, a consequence of feudal land ownership. By the 14th century, most English, Scottish, and Welsh people used surnames, especially given the unification with Wales under Henry VIII in 1536. A 4-year study led by the University of the West of England, which concluded in 2016, analyzed sources dating from the 11th to the 19th century to explain the origins of the surnames in the British Isles. The study found that over 90% of the 45,602 surnames in the dictionary are native to Britain and Ireland, with the most common in the UK being Smith, Jones, Williams, Brown, Taylor, Davies, and Wilson. The findings have been published in the Oxford English Dictionary of Family Names in Britain and Ireland, with project leader Professor Richard Coates calling the study more detailed and accurate than those before. Professor Coates elaborated on the origins. Quote, some surnames have origins that are occupational. Obvious examples are Smith and Baker. Other names can be linked to a place, for example, Hill or Green, which relates to a village green. Surnames that are patronymic are those which originally enshrined the father's name, such as Jackson or Jenkinson. There are also names where the origin describes the original bearer, such as Brown, Short, or Thin, though Short may in fact be an ironic nickname, surname for a tall person. Unquote. I can only imagine a Little John character from Robin Hood fame, or a giant meat castle of a biker being nicknamed Tiny. Once we arrived in the modern period, the interconnectedness of the world, with trade across the oceans, and the colonization of the Americas and Africa by European powers, brought about new reasons to use surnames. Many cultures around the world adopted family names, particularly for administrative reasons. Notable examples include the Netherlands in the late 18th century, Japan in the late 19th century under the Meiji Restoration, Thailand about 100 years ago in 1920, and Turkey as it modernized in the 1930s. The structure of the Japanese name was formalized by the government as family name first, plus the given name, in 1868. Nonetheless, the use of surnames is not universal. Family names sometimes change or are replaced by non family name surnames under political pressure to avoid persecution. Indonesians and Chinese Thais after migration there during the 20th century, or the Jews who fled to different European countries to avoid persecution from the Nazis before and during World War II. Other ethnic groups have been forced to change or adapt surnames to conform with the cultural norms of the dominant culture, such as in the case of slaves and indigenous people in the Americas. When immigrants came through Ellis Island and other immigrant processing centers in the United States, many of them had their unique and likely meaningful last names changed to be easier to pronounce in English or easier to understand by their spelling. This actually happened to my wife's grandmother's family name, going back to Syria in the late 19th century. Very generally, when describing last names, they can be put into four groups: patronymic, locative, occupational/status, and nicknames. The first surnames were quite simple, but they became more diverse and complex over the centuries. Patronymic names identify people as their father's children. For example, a father named Richard might have a daughter named Brooke. She might become known as Brooke Richards. That makes sense. And that's pretty common in the Western cultures that I'm familiar with, like the American culture. This also helps identify family members to share their resources with people with similar genetic material and keep wealth and power in a family going into the next generation of kin. This also helps for making sure no one is too closely related when getting married. Actually, for more information about that, see episode 9 of Threads of History about marriage. Locative surnames identify people based on where they were born, where they lived, or where they worked. For example, Sarah York was probably the Sarah who lived in the town of York. Locative names could also refer to a land feature where their house was located. Theodore Underhill or Karen Atwood probably got their names from references to hills or woods near where they lived. Occupational/status names were also common. They were based on jobs or social status. Andrea Baker was probably the Andrea in the village who was a baker. Other common last names were based on nicknames. These were usually words that helped to describe a person in some way. These may have been based on size, like calling somebody long, short, or little, or a personality characteristic, something like stout, or stern, or jolly. What do you think your nickname last name would be? Well, jolly sounds pretty good, actually, to me, but I could go for others. Based around the various immigrant groups coming to the United States, the common conventions of surnames would pass from Europe to the Americas. In fact, some Americans can trace their surnames all the way back to places from which their families emigrated. I can actually do this. I still have shell hammers in the town where my great 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 grandfather was born and ultimately decided to leave and settle in the US in the 1870s. It is in the Americas that we have a great demonstration of how that connection, not even a material or contact connection, but like a memory of what it was. It's especially powerful within families of those that were enslaved in American plantations. Slave owners often stripped enslaved people of both their first and their last names, giving them a new quote unquote Christian names so that they would lose their identity of African culture and embrace American culture. Americans and Canadians, and even the Spanish in Mexico, were known to try to erase the current culture as much as possible. And one of the ways to do that was to erase the names passed between each generation to the next generation. The original surnames were forgotten by enslaved people, and they were forced to use often their owners' last names. However, after the end of slavery, previously enslaved people had the chance to choose their own last names. Some would end up just with their former owners' names, just for simplicity's sake, or to make sure that they knew who they thought they knew. You know, be able to figure out, hey, is that the John I know from before? You know, who knows? Others took on the family names of important figures in American history, lots of Washingtons, Lincolns, or chose entirely new last names. Today, some people still choose their own last names, actually. They do so to make their names fit their personalities or their beliefs. So, where did your last name come from? Do you know? Could it have been a distant ancestor's occupation? And maybe it tells you what your great 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 grandparents looked like. Whatever your last name is, there's definitely a story behind it. My last name means noisy or large hammer, or you can translate it to sledgehammer in German. I don't know if that's my ancestor being like a stonemason or a quarry worker, or maybe he had some booming voice or something. Maybe he was a big strongman type. I'm not. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I have those genes. Maybe we hope. Now we're going to go through some examples of other origins for last names that might be more uncommon than those four big categories, but I think they're still pretty interesting. So let's talk about them. There were instances where a person would take a last name based on patronage, meaning that they worked for this person or supported this person as a member of their entourage or their attendant, their inner circle. These would be called patronal, meaning it came from patronage. For example, Hickman would mean Hick's man, and Hick at this time, or the time that this came about, was a pet form for the name Richard, which actually I feel like that's offensive these days. I'm not sure. Names were also associated with religious beliefs. Someone could be strongly Catholic and follow the teachings of St. Patrick, so they call themselves Kilpatrick, meaning a follower of Patrick, or Kilbride, meaning a follower of St. Bridget, or St. Bride is sometimes what she's referred to. Both of those from Ireland, actually. Ornamental surnames are made up of names not specific to any attribute, like a place or parentage, occupation, or caste of the first person to acquire the name, and stem from the middle class's desire for their own hereditary names, like the nobles. Once again, showing that the trend-setting nobility, they're always the first to do everything, and they were the ones that needed surnames before anybody else. These ornamental surnames were generally acquired later in history and when those without surnames were in need of them. In 1526, King Frederick I of Denmark, Norway, ordered that noble families must take up fixed surnames, and many of them took up their name, some sort of element of their coat of arms. For example, the Rosenkrantz, which is the rose wreath family, took their surname from a wreath of roses that is on the part of their coat of arms. The Guildenstern, which is Golden Star family, took theirs from a seven-pointed gold star on their shield. Subsequently, many middle-class Scandinavian families desired names similar to those of the nobles, and so they adopted these ornamental surnames. Most other naming traditions refer to them as acquired, but I feel like they're all acquired, aren't they? They might be given to people newly immigrated, new people that are conquered, converted, to a different religion potentially, as well as those with unknown parentage, people that are formerly enslaved or from parentage without a surname tradition. Ornamental surnames are more common in communities that adopted or were forced to adopt surnames in the 18th and 19th centuries. As I mentioned, formerly enslaved people, many of their names might be ornamental last names. Some examples of these ornamental names occurring in Scandinavia, they were among the Sinti and the Roma there, and for instance, the Jews in Germany and Austria. Examples would be Steinbach or Steinbeck, which would be derived from a place called Steinbach, Rosenberg, which means Rose Mountain, Winterstein, which is derived from a place called Winterstein. The forced adoption in the 19th century is the source of German, Polish, and even Italian ornamental surnames for people from Latvia, such as Rosenthal's or Rosenthal, which means Rose Valley, Eisenbaums, which means steel wood, Freibergs or Freebergs means free mountain. In regions with a strong religious influence, and I mentioned religious names before, but these newly acquired names were given by the religious leaders as part of naming ceremonies. So it'd be naming ceremony for a particular point in their religious studies or their membership in the church. They'd get a new name or an extra name. There's such a thing in the Catholic Church, because I grew up Catholic, that you have a confirmation name. And so that's supposed to embody something about you or something about your spiritual journey. And so I actually chose my middle name. But some people, at least a friend of mine, actually thought that you added that name to the rest of your name. So I chose my middle name as my confirmation name. So for him, he kept on saying it over and over again, like saying it twice. That's not terribly common today, but I do think that was something that happened uh, probably about 100 years ago. It's probably a little bit more common at that point. So the religion would dictate the type of surname that the person would get. But these are traditional surnames that are associated with that religion. So Islamic names would follow the Arabic patronymic naming conventions, but they would also include names like Muhammad or Ibn Abihi, Abihi, which means son of his father. Catholic names may have been influenced by the saint on whose feast day the person was christened, or the feast day of the person when they're confirmed, for instance. Christened means baptized. So, for instance, Toussaint and De Los Santos may have been christened on All Saints' Day. As native peoples of the Americas were assimilated by the conquering countries, they were often converted to the Christian religion, and so they would be christened with associated names, names associated with the religion, the Christian religion. So things like De La Cruz, of the cross, would come about. Others maintained a historical name or title or by name of an ancestor, as long as it was translated into the new language. So there are lots of First Nations, Native American names that are just translated from their Algonquin or their Lakota language into English, like saying something is someone's named Running Wolf or Feather, a few other things. Other examples of these ornamental nickname sort of surnames were simply given appropriate sounding invented names. There's the Markishtum, which is an example for members of the Maka tribe. I suppose that that means something significant within the Maka tribe, but they kind of just transliterated it so it sounds right in English, but it's a Maka word. Another category of acquired names is what's called foundlings names. Historically, children born to unwed parents or extremely poor parents would be abandoned in a public place or anonymously placed in an orphanage. Such abandoned children might be claimed and named after religious figures, community leaders, their adopted parents, of course, could name them. Some such children were given surnames that reflected their condition. Kind of like Game of Thrones, actually. Like Jon Snow, well, he's named or because he's in a particular area and he was a quote unquote bastard. He didn't have parentage that was noble. You'd have names like meaning innocent and pure and clean or young. Other children were named for their street or the place they were found. Like a child found on Union Street would have the last name of Union. The date they were found. So you have people being called Monday, September, spring. Even if there's a festival or feast day when they were found or they were christened. So you might have the last name of Easter. You might have a name like San Jose. Some foundlings were given the name of whoever found them. So it's like if somebody last name is Smith found them, then they would be called Smith. There are also many examples of gender specific versions of surnames, especially in Baltic languages like Latvian and Lithuanian, and most of the Slavic languages like Bulgarian, Russian, Slovak, and Czech. And there are other nations like Greece and Iceland where surnames change form depending upon the gender of the bearer rather than their marital status. Some Slavic cultures originally distinguished the surnames of married and unmarried women by different suffixes, but this distinction is no longer widely observed. In Slavic languages, surnames would have variants for males and females by changing an ending I into an A, like a Podwinski would change into a Podwinska in Polish, a Novi to a Nova in Czech or Slovak. In other cases, the female variant is derived from the male variant by the possessive suffix and then adding an OVA to the end. Novak would become Novakova based on the gender because it would be a woman carrying the name. Some rare types of surnames are universal and then gender neutral. Other times, the form used is different based on if the female is unmarried or is married into the family. In Polish, typical surnames for unmarried women end in OWNA, ANKA, or IANKA, while the surnames of married women use the possessive suffixes like INA or OWA. In Greece, if a man called Papadopoulos had a daughter, she will likely be named Papadopoulou if the couple has decided their offspring will take his surname, the male's last name. The genitive form, as if the daughter is of the man named Papadopoulos. The meanings of some names are unknown or unclear. In some instances, however, the name may have arisen from a specific place, with the spelling and the pronunciation changing over time and with emigration to a new country and translation into a new language. The same name may appear in different cultures by coincidence or romanization, changing the characters to Latin script. The surname Lee, Lee, is used in English cultures, but is also the romanization, the Latinization of the Chinese surname Li, Li. In French Canada, until the 19th century, several families adopted surnames that followed the family name in order to distinguish the various branches of a large family. Often it denoted a geographical trait of the area where that branch of the family lived, or some sort of personal trait of the family's patriarch. You simply added more to your surname to show that you were part of the original family, but a specific branch of the original family. So those are some of the less common but still interesting ways in how we've created last names and surnames for people. Uh, I think we've covered and given examples of just about everything I could find. Let me know or email me if you want to highlight a particular way that your family might have gotten their last name. It might have been one of the examples I didn't go into much. But I think it's pretty interesting stuff. And it's a very easy way for someone to learn a little bit more about their family if they look into their family name and their lineage, go through their ancestry and such. This thread of history brought us through various stages of human development. We started as hunter gatherers, but developed agriculture, the domestication of animals, and the technologies necessary to gather into cities. With the establishment of cities, we now created new problems, like how we might distinguish ourselves from others with our same given name. With that necessity came the creation of surnames or last names, family names, which might not have passed between generations at first, but now commonly are given as a way to connect ourselves to our ancestors and to mark the next generation as part of the family. It's a remarkable thing that shows each person's unique origin, but also is a common human experience. Everybody everywhere's got examples of these names. It's not very common you find somebody that doesn't have a given name and a last name. So, a very common human experience, and it can bring us together as a collective human society. Thank you for listening to this episode on the origin of last names. This has been Threads of History. I am Mike Redbeard, short sledgehammer, shellhammer. Thank you for listening. You can email your comments and suggestions to threads.historypodcast@gmail.com. Listen to more Threads of History on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify.